All right, today we are going to start talking about desert ecosystems, or not start talking about it. We're going to start and finish talking about desert ecosystems in this week. And so there will be a series of lectures that you'll need to watch for this week. So just to set the stage, we did some calculations determining the Köppen climate system code a few weeks ago. And so if you remember that first letter kind of divides the world up into 5 different categories, one of them being the letter B, which stands for arid ecosystems or arid climates. And so our deserts are all going to be under that B, or the arid systems. And if you look at our Whittaker diagram that we've looked at a little bit, of course the desert's going to be on the far left, the driest end of the Whittaker diagram. But do note like how much temperature space the deserts can occupy. I think we often kind of associate deserts as being these really hot, dry places, but they can occur in really cool places as well. So just keep that in mind, and we'll talk about an example of a cold desert in addition to some of these hot places. Okay, so this is kind of the framework and the organization of these videos. We're going to talk about some plant adaptations to surviving in these dry places. So we're going to talk about the general strategies that plants utilize. We'll talk a little bit about biological soil crusts, which will go along with the reading you did for this week, or that you will do for this week. Then we'll talk about warm deserts, cold desert, or the cold desert. Talk about some management issues in the desert. And then for the rest of this semester, as I talk about different ecosystem types or different biomes, we're going to focus on North America, but then I'll give you one example of this type of biome or ecosystem outside of North America. So today, or in this series of videos, we'll talk about the Namib Desert in Namibia. Okay, so let's talk about plant adaptations to arid climates. And when we're talking about plants growing in these arid areas, we're often thinking about a plant's ability to survive and tolerate drought conditions. So we need to think about what drought stress really is to a plant, how to quantify it, and then we'll be able to start thinking about these different strategies a little bit better. So what is drought stress? So if you go back to our Plant Phys Primer lecture, the second one, we talked a lot about water. And in that lecture, I talked about 2 ways plants kind of can fail under drought conditions. And the metric we used was water potential. So if you remember, water potential is a measure of potential energy of water. And for a plant in general, the more negative that value is, the less water is available for physiological functions. It becomes more and more difficult for the plant to carry on its typical functions under those really negative water potentials. And if you remember, there are 2 responses of the plant. One is living cells, like in the leaves, can lose turgor. So remember, turgor is the pressure of water out on the cell wall that helps provide that cell some structure. And if there's not enough water inside that cell, it'll collapse. And when it collapses, the physiology just starts to shut down really rapidly. The other thing that can happen is when the tension on the water column, this is me putting tension on a water column, if that tension is really great, it can actually pull water into the vessel elements. Once an air bubble enters, it quickly expands and fills that entire cell, and it can actually fill other cells, but we can just think about it as filling that one cell. And once it's filled with air, it's not going to be transporting water. And so the more of these embolisms that start to form, it decreases the ability of the plant to move water up to its leaves, and it's going to affect photosynthesis. So these are the 2 kind of responses we would expect in plants to dry conditions, and we can quantify that pretty well by drought stress. I do want you to think about, though, that in general we think about more negative numbers being more indicating greater drought stress in plants. But keep in mind, we do have plants adapted to operating at low water potential. So if you compare corn to a creosote bush, so creosote bush is a common shrub in the desert southwest of the United States, and of course corn is our most widely grown crop in the United States. So if they're both at -1 megapascal, neither one of them is that drought stressed. But at -2 megapascals, the corn is pretty drought stressed, but the shrub still isn't very drought stressed at -2. So it's a bit relative, and I just want you to keep that in mind, because drought stress for one plant might not be drought stress for another. And for now, we're going to really generalize and just say more negative numbers are bad, but just keep in the back of your mind that more negative numbers for some plants might be just fine. And I guess we probably won't talk about it more than that, but just keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, so quantifying drought stress, that really just goes along with what we talked about. Drought stress is the reduction of the water potential, and so we can quantify an individual plant's or a species drought stress by measuring that water potential. And so I'm going to draw again, even though my penmanship is horrible. But let's just think about what's happening during a drought. Oops. Let me... okay. Let's get back here. Okay. We are going to draw a couple axes. And let's do this on the x-axis. I'm going to draw a series of graphs that are all together. And what we're going to do for right now is we're going to put time on the x-axis. And what we're really thinking about is a season where we would have spring here. And hey, that penmanship's a little better this week. Fall over here. And so if we were to put, I'm going to put, ooh, this is going to be rough. Ugh. All right. Oh, it's so bad. Hopefully you can all read it. Soil moisture on the y-axis. Generally, what in North America, what we're seeing is going to be something like this. Oops. All right. So in the spring, we're going to have a decent amount of soil moisture from either spring rains or winter, like snow melt. And as it warms up and gets hotter, that soil moisture is depleted until the fall it's at some really low level. Now, of course, we might get rains in the middle here that will make it jump up a little bit, but this is generally our pattern for much of the US. Okay, now, if we have time, on the x-axis, and let's say we have water potential of the plant, generally what we would expect is this, right? We kind of drew a figure like this during the plant phys primer, where as the soil dries out, the leaf water potential also dries out. Or I didn't draw it, we looked at a figure that kind of showed this relationship. So this is generally what we would expect to see. And remember, if as water potential is declining in a plant, that basically tells the plant that there's not enough moisture to supply its needs. And so the response then of the plant is generally, I'm just going to do T for time again, and this time we're going to draw stomatal conductance, is really going to mirror these other ones. It might not happen at exactly the same time, but in general, as water potential is decreasing, stomatal conductance is going to respond to that and also decrease. And we could actually add photosynthesis to this, right? It could be either one, because as the stomates are closing down, it's cutting off that supply of CO2, and so we're going to get a reduction in photosynthesis. So generally, this is the response we would expect to see in plants as soil moisture is declining during a drought. So let's talk about how plants are dealing with these drought conditions, talk about the different strategies, and we're going to come back to and draw these figures for different types of strategies to think about how the plants are, I guess, what the strategy looks like from a data standpoint. Okay, so this framework that I'm going to present to you was first presented by Levitt in 1972. He published a couple books that were really on just plant stress in general. And he had a section on lots of like cold temperatures and drought and heat and physical stresses. So although what I'm going to present you today is specific to drought, there are these words here such as escapers, resistors, and avoiders, and tolerators. These are all words we can really use to describe a plant strategy in dealing with really any stress. And so we'll come back to these terms throughout the semester as we talk about plants' ability to grow in fairly harsh environments. Okay, so this is the framework we're going to use, and it's kind of at different levels. I started pointing to the screen, which would not help you at all. So these top two we're going to talk about first. We're going to contrast these two. Then we'll talk about avoiders and tolerators, and then we'll move down to water spenders, savers. All right, so let's talk about drought stress escapers first. So the word escaper hopefully makes you think of somebody or something fleeing some kind of stressful environment. So if we're thinking about predator-prey relationships and we think about a prey escaping a predator, it somehow got away from the predator, right? And it's able to escape and avoid ever being attacked by that predator. Similarly, a plant that escapes some stress, it basically is able to get away from that stress in some way so it doesn't actually have to deal with it. And since individual plants aren't moving, really what we're talking about is the timing of growth. And so I'm gonna come back to the slide and draw in just a second. When we're talking about drought stress escapers, we're really talking about ephemerals, and more specifically, oops, sorry about that. By the end of the semester, I'll be good at this. We're really talking about annuals or biennials. So biennials would have 2 years of growth. Annuals are just growing and completing their entire life cycle in 1 year. So that's what we're talking about with escapers. And so what we have for escapers is, let me get rid of this box. All right, so so remember, we're going to have time on the x-axis. And if we focus on our water potential for now of an annual, what's going to happen is it's going to stay relatively high. It might start to drop a little bit, and then we're going to switch, and this is the end of life cycle, okay? All right, this weekend I'm going to practice writing on this silly pad, see if I can get some decent penmanship. My penmanship's bad in general, but this makes it look worse than it actually is. So essentially what's happening is these plants are only growing when there's enough soil moisture to really supply them with all the water they need. And then when the soils start to dry out, they reproduce, they drop their seed, and they're done. And then their seed are what is able to tolerate these really dry conditions. So it's not an individual plant surviving the drought, but it's the population. As long as it can produce new seeds and drop those seeds before the drought, it's able to maintain the population of that particular species. So they're not even around, they're completely dormant in seed form when those droughts occur. So they're escaping those drought conditions. The other two things I want to say about the drought stress escapers is in desert ecosystems, they're really, really important. in providing a large amount of biodiversity. So that's where the biodiversity of deserts come from, which can be quite high in deserts, but they contribute very little to the biomass. So even in a good year where there's this picture here, you can see a lot of these purple and yellow flowers in the foreground. Those are annual plants. But even in this year where you see that much biomass, it's not contributing a ton of biomass to the desert ecosystems. Most of that productivity is from the plants, the perennial plants that are hanging around year after year. There are some examples in really harsh deserts where really no perennial plants can survive either. Then the biomass comes from the annual plants, because that's kind of like the only strategy that works in places with really harsh and frequent disturbance is annual plants. Okay. So that's it for our drought stress escapers. Oh, I was going to tell you a side story. So when I was working in Oregon and I had to go visit some folks working in California at Stanford, and I was visiting their field site, which is really close to the campus. And I was doing some calibration of their instrumentation and comparing data. But the night that I got there, I got a phone call from the person I was supposed to meet, a professor there at the time. And he said, "Troy, I'm really sorry, but I ended up leaving town because there's a huge bloom of plants at the Mojave Desert." And so that year was I think that was probably 15 years ago or so. And I think that's the best bloom since then. It was the best year in like about 25 years at the time. And so anybody that's a kind of a desert plant person was, not going to miss that kind of event because it happens so infrequently. So they're really special, amazing events. If you get to see one, definitely take advantage of it. Okay, let's move on now. We're going to focus a little more on the drought stress resistors. Now, the term resistor is referring to the fact that these plants are able to somehow resist the drought stress environment. That means they're able to continue growing or maintaining living tissue during the really dry environments. All right, so just so you can giggle at my penmanship again, drought stress resistors, they can maintain, maintain, oh gosh, this is ridiculous. Let's not do this. I won't put you through this. Let's insert a text box here. Okay, so these plants can maintain growth and or living tissue during drought. All right. And I'll save these slides like this and repost these with this new information. All right. That is our drought stress resistors. All right, and there's two ways that we can generally categorize plants as resisting drought. Again, that means growing or maintaining living tissue during a drought environment. And the first one we're going to talk about is this drought stress avoiders. So drought stress avoiders are kind of like plants in denial. All right, they're able to kind of like ignore and pretend the drought isn't happening. So what that means, if we think about the water potential of the tissue, is that it doesn't really change very much during a drought. So if we've got time here, and this is our moisture, I'm just going to put moisture, so I don't have to write more characters than necessary. So remember, this is what our soil moisture looks like during the drought, all right? But the water potential of avoiders is going to look not exactly like this. And that's not increasing, that's holding steady. Should I erase that? All right. So it might decrease a little bit. But in general, water potential is staying really constant. So that tells you that the tissues of that plant don't even know that it's a drought environment, right? Or drought conditions, because they think they've got all the water they need because water potential is staying relatively high. All right? So they're avoiding drought conditions or pretending they're not even existing. And there's two categories of drought stress avoiders: water spenders and water savers. So water spenders are going to look like this. So we've got that same x-axis, so we're still talking about this drought. And if we have stomatal conductance, it's going to stay relatively constant. They're going to keep using water during this drought, and that's usually because they either have really deep roots, or they might have a really expansive root system, or they might have both. So you can see this tree here has this root. This is already about 4 meters from that tree that this root has extended, and you can still see it's still relatively large. And so it can put out, these roots several meters from the trunk of the tree and explore that really wide area. And even though there's not a lot of moisture in that shallow soil layers, by extending its root system out, it can find every little bit of water out there and keep spending water. Or we've got examples of plants that can build roots that are many, many meters deep in the soil to try to find water and keep using it during the drought. All right, so this is how we might think about the water use of this plant during drought. So just a few examples of water spenders. So phreatophytes, these are plants that access groundwater. So those would be ones that can potentially build really deep roots. Evergreen shrubs, typically if you see an evergreen shrub in the desert, it typically has a really deep or wide root system, so it has access to a lot of moisture or a lot of soil, so it can get a lot of moisture. And then riparian trees as well. They're not always phreatophytes, so phreatophytes by definition are tapping into groundwater. Riparian trees aren't necessarily tapping into groundwater, but they might be like below the water table for a large part of the year. But as that water table drops, they might lose access to that. So there are 3 main examples of drought stress avoiders, water spenders. There are going to be other types of plants that don't fall into these categories that might exhibit that strategy. Keep in mind that, but in general, these are our best examples. Okay, then our drought stress avoiders, water savers are plants that are reducing transpiration during drought. So I'm going to have to draw a smaller figure here, but what these plants are going to look like, the water, whoa, let me just say my penmanship was pretty good on that one. All right, this is the reduction in stomatal conductance during that drought. So it's really clamping down on stomates to resist resist water loss, conserve water. Remember though that for both of these plants, so we've got our water savers look like this. Our water spenders are still continuing to spend water. But remember, the water potential of both of these types of plants looks like this, relatively constant through the drought, right? So go back down here. I went way past it. Let me go back up to this one. So just a few different ways that plants might reduce water loss. Certainly closing the stomates is going to be one, but stomates are generally a bit leaky. They don't seal off totally tight. And so there's additional strategies plants might use. This plant, for example, reduces the amount of leaf area exposed to the sun by folding its leaves over so that they're together. So you can see this is, on the left hand, this is a branch that was just cut off the plant. On the right side, this is a branch that was cut off the plant about 5 minutes before the picture was taken. And so once you cut off its water supply, the leaves started to dry out and they folded over. In grasses, we see them rolling their leaves potentially really tightly. So different ways that plants might reduce the amount of leaf area exposed to the sun by folding or rolling. This picture here is a cross-section of a leaf, and I just want to draw your attention to this top kind of whitish layer. This is the cuticle of the leaf. And on this one, it's this really thick layer of wax. And that wax can help reduce the amount of water lost from that leaf. And that would be another way to help it conserve and save water. A few other examples are succulents. So plants that generally utilize CAM photosynthesis, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. These plants are really good at taking up a bunch of water and then closing off their stomates and just holding on to that water as long as possible. I put this picture on here because it's a really cool one. These types of plants are often called window plants. What you can see, this is the soil surface on the far left here. Actually, let me get rid of that. On the far left here, this is the soil surface, and this is the top of the leaf, but the leaf actually continues down into the soil. And it's hard to see on this one, but this top of this leaf is a bit translucent, so light can penetrate down inside the leaf, and then the photosynthetic machinery is down inside there and is capturing that light as it passes through. If you're ever in one of the nurseries around town, look in their succulent section, because a lot of times they'll have these for sale, and you can see a little bit better how that they're a bit translucent on the top. And I also have this one here. This is a type of elephant tree. I just want to point it out because for me, I think about succulents a lot as being like green, like a cactus, but there are woody species that also can store lots of water in their trunks. And so it doesn't always have to be a green stem. It could be a woody stem like this. And then lastly, deciduous shrubs in deserts. So a couple slides ago, I showed how these leaves were folding over for reducing leaf area. Plants might also drop their leaves to reduce area or a portion of their leaves. So sagebrush, for example, if you look closely, there's two different types of leaves on these shrubs. In the spring, they'll produce these nice big, well, relatively big leaves. But during dry conditions, they drop those big leaves, and what's left over are these fairly small and tougher leaves that can handle those drier conditions better. So dropping some of the leaves can help reduce leaf area and conserve water as well. So some different examples of how plants can avoid drought by either spending water, which is mainly by building a really extensive root system, or saving water, and there's several different examples of how to do that. So I want you to be familiar with those examples and be able to provide those examples as we talk about this a little bit more. Okay, the last category here is our drought stress tolerators. These are plants that can tolerate and handle drought conditions. And so what that means is these plants can grow, continue to grow and survive even though water potential gets really low in their tissues. So they experience reduced leaf water potential, and the cells in these plants experience what we would think about as drought stress. Right? These are the plants that actually can operate with less water than the other plants. So just to give another diagram. So we would expect these plants to have this pattern. So these plants would allow their leaf water potential to decrease, but that doesn't mean stomatal conductance would decrease. Stomatal conductance of these plants it's going to decrease some, but not a lot. All right, so they're still able to continue using water through these stressful conditions. All right, so our drought stress tolerators, the two best examples are perennial desert grasses. So the grasses that occur in the desert ecosystems are generally pretty good stress tolerators. They still, at some point they have to give up as well, but they can grow under pretty dry environments. And then shrubs that are fairly shallow rooted, they generally have the ability to keep working and photosynthesizing even as their water potentials decrease. And just one other example while we're talking about it, juniper. So the juniper species that we find in the western U.S., not all of them, but most of the ones in the western U.S. are really good drought stress tolerators. They're going to keep photosynthesizing even at really negative water potentials. Okay, then the last thing, I got couple more things to say. All right. So we're talking about plant adaptations to dry environments right now. So remember we talked about CAM photosynthesis and that this type of photosynthesis is really well adapted to hot and dry conditions. And so just keep that in mind, that that's a photosynthetic type, or a type of plant that we find really commonly in desert ecosystems. Since we covered it a couple weeks ago, I won't go into any more detail than that, but just remember that's an important component. And then I already kind of touched on this, but I just want to say it again, that the actual structure and allocation patterns of plants in desert ecosystems is really maybe not their prime way to acclimate or adapt to drought conditions, but it is a really powerful way for them to continue growing in these environments. And so the two things we see, I've already said, wide root systems and deep root systems, but you can see in general, even though we talked about that in relation to a specific strategy, in general we see those types of plants with deeper and wider root systems occurring in drier systems. So this graph here was taken, this is a global data set, so somebody compiled data from research that had gone on all over the world and put all of these points together. The x-axis is MAP, so mean annual precip. And so down here, we're talking about 100 millimeters of precip, so really dry conditions. And the plants in those areas tend to have the largest lateral root spread. So they're spreading the roots out the widest. And then as you get to wetter and wetter places, that tends to go down. There's still a lot of spread, but in general, we're seeing a decrease in the lateral spread. And you can kind of see that on this graph here. This is the one-sided lateral root spread. This is by plant functional group, not by ecosystem type. But I will point out the shrubs, which are really common and dominate a lot of desert ecosystems, that their lateral root spread for, this is just one species way out here, but can go out to as much as 50 meters. So that's 150, about feet, probably closer to 180 feet. And then you can see succulents as well have fairly wide root spread. So these plants are generally allocating more of the resources to spreading really wide, or I guess we'll do wide. I meant to add a picture of deep and I forgot. Maybe I'll try to show that in lab. Got a cool picture of people doing some work on roots down in caves. Okay, so that's all for the adaptations of plants. I'll stop the video now and I'll make another one on biological soil crusts.